Hello, everybody. Let me just totally trick your brain up a little bit here. Expecting the what's up, my dudes, give you a little hello. Hey, guys. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another video. Let me be the typical YouTuber here. Okay, so I like to keep your brain thinking a little bit, right? Keep it interesting. Okay, so I wanted to go in here and talk about this whole terrain deformation with just in general on these milestone games, how it's been over the years, but also sort of how could possibly be in MXGP 2020 and sort of what's going on with all that in correlation with obviously the new MXGP game coming out, right? So I'm really shocked. I'm being completely honest. I'm actually dumbfounded that there is nothing on their website for this MXGP 2020 game talking about any sort of terrain deformation improvement, terrain deformation update, literally nothing at all about that, at all. So, and you would just imagine they would have to adjust it some, they would have to do some things to it. You know, it's just so hard for me to believe they would just keep the exact same terrain deformation from MXGP 2019 and just carry it over to MXGP 2020. So, I don't know. I mean, they're not saying anything about it, but I almost feel like they might be doing a little. They're not going to do a lot to it, obviously. I mean, that's, you know, let's just keep it real right now. That's pretty obvious. They're not doing anything drastic to it, but I just have this feeling like they are going to make minor tweaks to it. So the thing with these milestone games this whole time, right, you don't have a lot of, well, you basically had like no pre-made inside ruts, pre-made roughness. Hell, for the longest time, you didn't even have actual pre-made berms on the tracks or anything like that. They were just flat tracks, basically just elevation flat tracks around the whole track. That's what we've had for years in these milestone games. And then right around that, like MXGP Pro, MXGP, 2019 era, they kind of started getting the outside berms a little bit bigger, started adding just a little bit of roughness on some of the tracks, but that's about it. They still haven't really started adding hardcore inside pre-made ruts or, actual hardcore roughness or like, ruts that'll actually grab you in the corners or ruts going up jump faces. Really, it's all just this visual thing. It's this bizarre, like super soft, terrain design to all their tracks, but it looks like there's these little individual ruts in it, but it's all soft. It's like sand. You just blow right through it. So it's just a facade. It's not really like that, right? So they've got to do something here. They've either got to start doing a shitload of pre-made or they got to advance their terrain deformation system. You've got to do one of the two. You can't just keep having these basic, boring, no rut, no roughness, no big berm style tracks in the game. You just can't. And then your terrain deformation, for the longest time, for basically forever, all it really does is just creates these visual ruts on the track. It's not making actual ruts that are going to grab you. It's not really making kickers on the jumps. It's not really digging down the jump faces. It's not really doing anything. Like I'm saying, how they've had their tracks forever, where it sort of has that super, soft feeling to it, way too cushiony feeling, where you just blow right through whatever kind of rut it looks like was there. It's just, there's really is no rut there. Well, that's how the terrain deformation has been in these games forever. It just, even if it does sort of make any kind of a little rut, it just creates, it's really just more of a visual thing. You can just blow right in and out of it. You're not going to cross rut. It's not actually going to grab you. It's really just a fake terrain deformation system in a way. It's one of the most basic terrain deformation systems you could ever have in a motocross game. That's the way these milestone games have been forever. They're not even really a terrain deformation system. So until they start making those, terrain deformed ruts actually start grabbing you, make them a little more sturdy, make them a little more hard. You can't just push right through them. You don't want to go overboard with that, right? There's a balance to it. You got to have a cushiony, but then also a hard feeling to the terrain deformed ruts in the game. And that's how you get into creating different kinds of terrain deformation depending on what kind of track compound you're on. So when you're on a sand track, it should obviously be softer. You can kind of blow through the ruts a little more, but when you're on a hard pack track, it should be like sturdy. The ruts are not even moving at all, so it gives you more of that blue groove style feeling. The roughness should be like that kind of small, choppy, really hard roughness on the hard pack tracks, and on the sand tracks, it should be more kind of rolling, soft roughness through the corners and shit. And that's how you create that cool, different kind of filling on the different kind of track dirt compounds like what Reflex has in it, right? I feel like Reflex has nailed that aspect probably better than any game ever has before. The sand tracks, the terrain deformation on the sand tracks, the cushion softness versus the hard packed, style of the normal dirt tracks, and some of the more dry style tracks is like completely different gameplay elements to it, right? The terrain deformation feels completely different on a track like Sandwick than it would on a track like Pine Top, right? It's going to make completely different kinds of ruts and designs, and even just the pre-made versions of the tracks are completely different on every single kind of track in the game. So you've kind of learned how these motocross games, the tracks are sort of comprised of like the pre-made on the track, and then depending on how you have your terrain deformation, then that is going to sort of compile on top of whatever sort of pre-made that you have. So it's got those two things have to meld together into one, right? Whereas basically these milestone games have just had neither. They've not really had any pre-made, and then their terrain deformation doesn't even really do anything anyways. So they've not even had either one, right? It's not like they just have a crazy amount of pre-made and no terrain deformation really, or it's just like they have a crazy amount of terrain deformation and then no pre-made. They just don't really have either one, right? So that's the way these milestone games have been forever, but they've got to do something at this point, man. I mean, it's just getting to that point where they got to do something with these track designs. I mean, it's just getting so boring and so repetitive, and so they have got to advance their scaling a little bit on their motocross games. The difference between like I feel like they got the scaling in Supercross 3 just about perfect for a Supercross game, an official Supercross game, right? Like, yeah, some of the tracks could have had a slightly bigger of a scaling filling, but in general, it was pretty great. But with a lot of these specifically MXGP motocross games, it's like they make the whole track, the jumps, the corner, everything is just too one-to-one scaled. And that's like I've been saying forever, Yeah, you're trying to make replica tracks, but you're still in a video game, okay? And not only that, but you're in an arcade motocross game. Therefore, if you make these super small jumps, small berms, small everything, that is going to create a more boring, easy, way too, simplistic gameplay experience than, certain motocross tracks on Reflex that have a little bit bigger, jump skill gap. The motocross jumps kind of throw you up in the air a little bit more. That is just so much more fun riding on tracks like that than having these super boring, everybody and their grandmother could hit every single jump rhythm on every track with their eyes closed, like these MXGP games have been for so long. I always kind of talk about it like in these motocross games, if you're making a replica track specifically, you want to make it everything like 25% bigger than what you would think one-to-one scaling would be, right? So I'm not saying make it like double the size of one-to-one scaling, because that would be too much. But a lot of times when you only make it like 25% longer jumps, bigger jumps, 25% more peak to the jumps, 25% maybe wider than you think it would be in real life, and kind of making the corners, just the entire scaling of the whole track. If you make that, on average, 25% bigger than what you would think would be one-to-one scaling to the bike, that shit seems to work perfectly in these motocross games. For whatever reason, I don't know why that is, but it's like when you're in there in a game, obviously that's not going to be as difficult as riding a real-life dirt bike, right? So if you have the same sort of quote-unquote, track size in jump sizes and one-to-one scaling like you would have in real life, but you're playing a video game that is way easier than riding in real life, you can see how that video game is going to become a lot more boring and way too easy because you're riding on the exact size jumps that you would have in real life. It's just never worked in these games, guys. This whole true one-to-one scaling bullshit has never worked. It doesn't work in MX Simulator. It doesn't work in these arcade motocross games. It's just boring. It just creates the most boring fucking no skill gap, no real fun to the track that I've ever seen in these games. They need to get away from that 100% one-to-one scaling crap that they've been doing in these games for the past couple years. Shit's getting out of hand, man. It's getting insane. It's like, so what you got to do is you just got to amp everything up just a little bit to where it still gives you that real feeling, that real feeling of that real life track, but at the same time, it's still fun and replayable and skill gapped enough to separate yourself in an arcade motocross game. It's still fun enough to do that, right? One-to-one scaling is the fun factor killer in these games. It really is. Yeah, you might have a perfectly replicated one-to-one scaling track to the bike, but if the gameplay is not fun because of that, then what have you really accomplished? You see what I'm saying? You've got to get away from that super one-to-one scaling shit. And it's just so much more apparent in these MXGP games because the jumps are already small in general, a lot of times. So, I don't know. It just kills a lot of the fun factor. But definitely let me know down in the comments what you guys think about the whole terrain deformation side of MXGP 2020. I just don't think we're going to get a whole lot with that, and that's really unfortunate. I really hope, Milestone sees this video and kind of realizes that they need to update that and improve that. It's either they're going to have to really change that, like I said, either the pre-made on the tracks or really improve on the terrain deformation, or the track designs are going to be shit and boring. They're going to have to either really improve on making it not so one-to-one scaling, or really improve on the terrain deformation, or they're going to have to do something, They're getting to that point where they've had the same kind of track designs in these MXGP games for so long that they just can't keep going like this, man. And from the trailers, from the trailer, let me say that, the track designs really didn't look all that much different, man. It didn't look like you had 4 individual inside hardcore pre-made ruts. Didn't really look like the terrain deformation was doing anything different, in combination with them not saying anything about a terrain deformation improvement on their website on the features page, right? So it just doesn't look like a whole lot of improvement to that. I mean, yeah, in that one little picture it showed, I think it was technically in the track editor, it did show a bit of a bigger inside, like, kind of berm. It wasn't even really a rut. It just looked like an inside berm. Maybe there'll be a couple tracks that's got one inside berm. Holy shit. But I don't think you're going to see anything like, actual hardcore roughness, 4 individual inside ruts that'll actually grab you and like all this actually making hardcore pre-made. So that's really unfortunate, man, but we'll just have to wait and see. So either way, appreciate you guys watching all the videos. Later, dudes.